Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Uh, Thank you all for joining us for this important session on ensuring data security and sovereignty for farmers. I am Rahul Agrawal. I'm partner and director at Intellicap Advisory Services. Uh, just to give you a brief background about Intellicap, Intellicap is an advisory firm that works towards building enabling ecosystems and channeling capital knowledge and network to create sustainable and equitable society. The importance of this session emanates from the thesis that increasing digitization of agriculture sector and the resulting generation of large amounts of digital information or data, as we say, have high implications for smallholder farmers and other stakeholders within the agriculture ecosystem. While on one side, there are benefits associated with the data sharing as more and more structured data would provide opportunities to smallholder farmers to access efficient and innovative services or improve extension services or help them or rather enable them to make informed decisions to improve their operations. On the other side, constraints around control over the data and its usage is posing an imminent threat. The concerns around data sovereignty and security becomes more prominent in the context where data collection happens from multiple sources across geographies, and there exists a complex nature of engagement between the agriculture stakeholders. We've seen examples where these concerns were unaddressed, when unaddressed, has led to distrust amongst the farmers, data providers, and data receivers, and we've seen this across the agricultural value chains. While we explore during the day, as you've joined us, while we've explored models for increased collaboration through data sharing between the ecosystem players, it is also important to explore role of data security in ensuring meaningful data sharing in agriculture, while at the same time safeguarding the interests of smallholder farmers and other players within the ecosystem. And this is what we will aim to achieve through this session. To take the session forward, I would like to extend a warm welcome and introduce our three distinguished panelists. We have with us Ms. Lindsay Moore. Lindsay is CEO and founder of Develop Matrix. It's a women-owned artificial intelligence company that breaks down technology barriers to improve the impact of development projects. She's an expert at applying AI approaches to designing, managing, and evaluating development projects in the areas of economic growth, agriculture, environment, public financial management, and education. Mr. Moore has also served as a foreign service economist at USAID for 11 years. My next panelist is Mrs. Srinivas Rao. Srivatsa is a co-founder and CEO of TraceX Technologies. It's an agri and climate tech startup based in India. TraceX is a technology platform that leverages the power of blockchain to ensure end-to-end traceability of food across supply chain. Over his 20 years of experience, he has led many initiatives around software product management, engineering, and solution sales in both enterprise software corporations as well as startups in agriculture, food, and education space. We also have Ms. Claire Rhodes. Claire is CEO and founder of Producers Direct. Producer Direct is an award-winning enterprise led by farmers for farmers, and it focuses on designing farmer-led solutions to the challenges faced by them worldwide. And it provides a range of farmer-led services in person and digitally, focusing on areas such as training and information services, access to financial services, access to market, and also looking at access to data to support farmers taking smarter and more informed decision. Uh, Going forward, we will have the session divided into three sections. And our first section, we would like to understand the role of data security in agriculture, data sharing ecosystem. And here I turn Lindsay for your comments. We know digital technologies collect, store, integrate, and analyze farm data for prediction and decision making. Given your workspace, what is the role of data security in agriculture data sharing ecosystem? Over to you, Lindsay. Lindsay, you are on mute.
Thank you so much, Raul, and thanks for the introduction. Great to be here. Yeah, so in Developmetrics, we work with AI, as you mentioned, in order to inform decision-making, mostly of donors and others implementing development projects, NGOs, and governments. And we use AI to actually create the evidence base of what works in farming, how to help increase agricultural productivity and address climate threats and other kind of threats that face farmers today, especially in developing countries. And in doing so, thankfully, we have had incredible advances in AI, which enables us to really analyze the entire evidence base, everything that's ever been written about agriculture, practices in academic articles, all past project data. But we also find gaps in existing evidence of what works, so we can really help predict which interventions will be most effective in a specific context. And in doing so, we often have to fill these gaps with field level farmer data. And so data security plays a crucial role in filling these gaps, in creating, as you mentioned, Raul, the environment for trust, which is really essential in any sort of, project or initiative where you want to have an open exchange of information. Without that environment of trust, your marketplace where you can supply data, and you also have to, of course, gather data. And that trust is the key link that enables that interaction to really flow in a meaningful way. And we've worked a lot with USAID, looking at mapping every digital technology they've ever used historically, and particularly within the agriculture space. And we found that while projects are using digital technologies and data platforms much more, security measures are not keeping pace with the degree to which these interventions are being introduced in the field. And it's a huge gap that we're seeing. And we've seen a lot of kind of negative externalities from this increased use of data and this increased data sharing. While it's a huge opportunity, the challenges that can be faced when you don't have a strong data sharing ecosystem are really severe. For example, farmers are sharing, of course, crop yields, financial information on farming practices. And we have seen cases where it is not secured properly, and that has led to instances of unauthorized access, misuse, or even theft of data, which has this really serious consequences for farmers, from loss of competitive advantage, exploitation of sensitive information, or even kind of misuse of personal data. There was one partner we were considering working with where we saw that they really did not have proper data security measures in place when gathering information from farmers. And it actually caused to them having to leave a certain community, because the community believed that sensitive information was actually authorized by a larger agricultural corporation. And they thought that was fostering an environment of unfair competition that enabled this corporation to really gather and analyze farmer practices to gain a competitive advantage, which they believed resulted in a lot of farmers being squeezed out of the market because they lack the same kind of knowledge or resources to compete. And so you can see environments like that where that will create an area of distrust and will really actually hinder these types of really important data sharing environments. And kind of the other challenge I've seen most commonly is a fear around manipulation of market prices. So a lot of farmers can be concerned that if market pricing is exposed or leaked, there can be bad actors who might manipulate the prices to their advantage. And so by giving access to detailed data on supply and demand, this could potentially harm small farmers. And so we found that when using digital platforms, it's really important not only to teach people how to use these platforms, how to share data, but also really create that human connection is often sometimes missing in these platforms, and really show people how the data is being used, educate them around it, and also create frameworks where they also benefit from it, which I believe is something that we will talk about a bit later. So, yep, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lindsay. And you've brought about, you've really set the context in terms of looking at this environment of trust, lack of environment of trust that can facilitate open data or open information exchange, and also how do this particular lack of the environment or an enabling environment is leading to a lot many external negative externalities. Uh, Coming to Srivatsa, TraceX works on the blockchain aspect.
Yeah.
Based on your experience, how do you see the role of blockchain in from two aspects? One is enhancing data security,
Yeah.
and also in terms of as a big enabler for data sharing.
Sure, absolutely. But firstly, thank you so much for having me on this panel. Like I was introduced, I'm Srivatsa. I'm the co-founder and CEO of TraceX Technologies. The topic itself is extremely relevant and touching for us because we're in the business of creating credible and transparent data sets for food and agriculture supply chains. That's what we do for our living. And data sets are predominantly used for multiple use cases, eventually achieving, things like farm to fork traceability. It could be sustainability, or someone wanting to reduce the carbon emissions, and someone wanting to create legitimate carbon credits on the platform, and so on and so forth, and eventually access to finance for smallholder farmers, and so on and so forth. So we sort of work with data, addressing multiple use cases. And we do this through our blockchain powered platform. Fundamentally, it addresses a few fundamental challenges that I want to link it back to the question here, which is around current supply chains working in as a disparate system, not necessarily as connected actors, right? That's one of the challenges that we see, where technologies like blockchain can come in and help in creating auditable and verifiable data beyond the upstream suppliers and downstream buyers. So that's what we do as an overall technology. But very quickly touching upon why blockchain and how blockchain probably can enhance the data security itself. I think it must be viewed, the data security itself, in my opinion, must be viewed from two lenses, in my opinion. Like, what are the standard operating procedures that are put in when it comes to collecting data, sharing data, storing data, and so on and so forth, right? Which is mostly boils down to the procedures that we have in data collection and other things. But when you look at it from the other lens, which is from a technology perspective, how can technology enhance the data security itself? I think that's where blockchain becomes extremely relevant and contextual for fundamentally for creating a platform that essentially creates a very secured data sharing platform, right? Which goes back to the fundamental characteristics of blockchain. For example, it's going to be mostly on the tech side benefits of the blockchain, is where, based on our experience, we'll add a couple of points here, where fundamentally blockchain works on the principle that data is never held with one single party, which essentially means that all of a sudden it just makes it so much more harder for somebody to manipulate data, because it's spread as a decentralized network. If there are multiple participants or actors on the network, each one of them have copy of the data that must be democratically shared across the entire supply chain participants, right? So that ensures that the network participants have fair access to the data, and there is no single point of data store. Therefore, there is no single point of data compromising as well. So that's one of the ways technologies like blockchain could definitely help. Secondly, immutability and encryption of data. So any data that goes into blockchain typically goes through an encryption of data, especially if you're talking about PII, personally identifiable information, and so on and so forth. Again, we will probably touch upon it in the next few questions, but the fundamental characteristic of a blockchain that does not allow manipulation of the data itself by any, let's say, fly-by-night operators, right? So intruders, so to say. Data is firstly encrypted with some cryptographic algorithm that needs combination of private, public key, etc. for somebody to decrypt, and then even if they manage to decrypt, there is, and even if they manage to eventually modify the data, there is still a very strong trail of the audit that's left behind, right? So those are some of the things that actually makes it more secure, in my opinion. And I think fundamental, again, the characteristics where it goes back to the data goes into a blockchain, transactions go into the blockchain as blocks, right? So there is always a reference for a previous block and the future block. So there is no somewhere in between somebody, inserting the data or manipulating the data without being in that chain. So that, I think, is a important factor that constitutes to the security of the data. Thirdly, I would talk about, let's say, and which I guess is one of the most important aspects of the blockchain is the way the blockchain is constructed itself. Blockchain must always be constructed as a network where multiple participants are coming together in a data sharing economy. Obviously, this differs. The way network is constituted differs from private and public blockchains and so on and so forth. We'll not touch upon it now. But the fact of the matter is that entire data sharing network is governed by a set of rules that must be abided by everybody who is accessing this data or ingesting the data over to the network. And that's the consensus mechanism. No data can be pumped into a blockchain by an unauthorized user without a consensus that is established based on the rules that are set up on the network. I think that's another one that adds particularly for foreign data to be ingested into blockchain, eventually making it very secure. And like I said before, I think what finally stands out is the fact that the verifiability and auditability of the data eventually shines. We're making it possible to validate the entire history of the transaction of all the participants in the ecosystem. I think so. Those are some of the points that I would say in terms of the data, enhancing the data security itself. Lastly, the blockchain allows the data exchange with commonly established consensus, and I think that's what allows us to represent data or digital asset or any data as a digital asset, which can be shared across the platforms. It can be shared very democratically across the participants with more confidence is where I would say. So that's largely what is my feedback, and I'll pause here, but that's my feedback on that point. Yeah.
Thanks, Srivastava. You very well articulated how technology can enable creation of a more secured data sharing platform where data is encrypted, data anonymity is maintained, data is democratically shared, data is verifiable, data is auditable. So it ticks various mini boxes that are also from a data principles perspective looks at alignment or ensures adherence to those data sharing principles. We've now looked at the perspective of the solution or the service providers. Now let's shift our focus to the smallholder farmers. And Claire, who better than you, working with Producer Direct, help us understand what does data ownership and security means or looks like when we are talking from a smallholder farmer's perspective. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks so much, Rahul. And yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the farmers are best placed, but I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is how you actually empower smallholder farmers to be critical actors in this process. And so thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. And yes, I really want to focus today on what data ownership looks like from the perspective of an average smallholder farmer. Drawing on Producers Direct's experience working with smallholder farmers over the last 12 years, particularly the work that we've done on shaping the development of digital tools and data systems to respond to farmers' needs. So I'm going to share our work today in two key areas. Firstly, farmer design solutions to enable farmers to manage and take ownership of their data. And secondly, how you enable farmers to benefit from the pioneering data systems that exist for agriculture, but at the moment are not sufficiently benefiting smallholder farmers. You heard a brief introduction to Producers Direct, but just to recap, so Producers Direct over the last 13 years has reached and benefited the lives of over 1 million smallholder farmers in East Africa and Latin America. And we've achieved this through building a farmer-led model that blends in-person and digital services across finance, training, market access, and data. And I wanted to emphasize the in-person bit because often we lose sight of the fact that digital often works best when it's underpinned by strong in-person infrastructure to support the digital insights and the services that are being offered. So what does data ownership and security look like from the perspective of a smallholder farmer? Well, okay, so first of all, a reality check. A typical data management system for a smallholder farmer is a notebook and pencil. The average age of the smallholder farmers that we work with is over 65. And so mostly they're comfortable with that. You know, we've worked in many workshops with smallholder farmers on data and data systems. And often, you know, a quote from one farmer is, I'm analog and I stay analog. And so even in situations where farmers do have access to smartphones, the use of smartphones to support the management of agricultural data by smallholders themselves still remains really limited. And that's particularly the case for female smallholder farmers worldwide. We're still seeing farmers at best trusting SMS when it comes to digital information channels, with overall digital literacy and confidence remaining low. And so when you think about data being managed on a piece of paper, what does data ownership and security look like for a smallholder farmer? That's definitely something I'd like us to unpack in this discussion for sure. The other significant challenge is that typically a smallholder farmer would not appreciate the value of their data, let alone take ownership of it. So why would an average smallholder who's keeping their data records on a notebook believe that their notes actually have value? And as we've touched on already in this discussion, there's so many external parties currently collecting data from smallholder farmers, whether it's for traceability standards, research project, impact tracking, including NGOs like Producers Direct. Still very rarely is that data then shared back with farmers. And so often farmers are contributing their data and never see it again. And certainly, well, very rarely are they paid for it. And so why would the farmers themselves value the data enough to hold other actors accountable for the security of that data? And so very infrequently, a farmer is actually supported by these external parties to understand the potential value of the data, not only to the external party who's collecting it, but actually the value of the data to the farmers themselves. This data has huge potential, as we've talked about, to inform their management practices and decision-making, but farmers themselves aren't necessarily being supported to realize those benefits. And so if we think about the conditions that need to take place for smallholders to effectively benefit and take ownership of their data. So I would argue that firstly, data systems need to be designed from the foundation of the reality, knowledge, and experience of the smallholder farmers you're working with. If you're designing a data system to benefit smallholder farmers and to value their data, they have to play a leadership role in the design process of that system. And that can often feel difficult and time-consuming when you're doing multiple workshops with farmers and testing different ideas. But ultimately, Producers Direct believes it's the heart of a sustainable solution. And secondly, really key to farmers understanding the value of their data is ensuring they actually can realize value from their data, both short and the long term. And so, as I'll talk about a bit later in the panel, a key focus for Producers Direct has been to support farmers to not only contribute their data, but actually look at how they can benefit from the insights that are being generated. Not only on short-term and longer-term decisions on how the farm is performing, but also looking at models where farmers can financially benefit from contributing their data to a bigger system. For example, testing willingness to pay of other stakeholders for aggregated databases from smallholder farmers. And so I'd like to sort of end with the point that ultimately farmers have to understand the value of their data in order to have more power in holding other actors accountable for the security of that data. And so that's something I'd love for us to pick up more as we go on through this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And clearly articulating the smallholder farmers' expectation in terms of actually playing a meaningful role when you are designing the data sharing system, and also looking at such kind of conviction when it comes to the yes, data sharing has a potential benefit for them, and it can lead to various innovative products and solutions that would in the long term benefit them. Thanks for articulating that. uh, I move on to the next section now that we've understood what does data security implies from a farmer perspective, and also and how can technology play an enabling role. Moving now on to understanding uh, what are the challenges in adopting the data security standards? And we can look at it from two perspectives. One, in terms of the adoption of the existing data sovereignty and security standards or processes, and also looking at challenges in complying with the data security regulations that currently exist in agriculture. And I would now turn to Lindsay to help us understand the first part, which is in terms of what are the challenges with regards to the adoption of data sovereignty and security for data sharing in agriculture.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Roel. And there are a lot of challenges to talk about, but I guess maybe first just to respond to Claire and Srirasta, because I think they really came up with some important points about also solutions in addition to challenges, particularly in talking about blockchain, and also actually making sure farmers benefit and are aware of the benefits of their data. And there are some really interesting models coming out of researchers at the UN, I believe led by Martin Smith, on ownership economy. And how do you use blockchain to incentivize farmers not only to, depending on how much data they participate, also get ownership and governance rights associated with the data that they're sharing, so that they not only have a financial incentive, which is important, but also looking at the motivations of small farmers. They found that the financial incentive, of course, is great, but actually having ownership over the rights and a vote and a voice, almost in a cooperative model. But the cooperative model has now, thanks to blockchain technology, advanced into this new ownership economy model, which enables whole new smart contracts and ways for data to be incentivized and share in an incredible way that just opens so many new doors, which I think is really important given the challenges, which was really the question that I'm supposed to be answering right now. And so we see a lot of challenges, and I think Claire's reality check about what's actually happening on the field when we're talking about blockchain and ownership economy models, which is definitely where we want to get to, but then thinking about where are we actually with the paper and the pen model is probably the most important challenge that we're seeing. We find that a lot of projects, the biggest challenge across all digital projects that donors are promoting is connectivity. So just these very simple, having the internet access, having the mobile network is the #1 reason that these types of initiatives fail. So just the general infrastructure is still a key hurdle that until we solve that, farmers are not going to be connected in a way that's useful for them to the kind of data that they need to. And then, of course, the literacy, as Claire mentioned, farmers might not have the technical capabilities or financial resources really to implement even to share their data, nevertheless think about what are the data storage and transmission systems that they really need in place. So this can really create barriers to adoption of data sovereignty and security, and it prevents farmers from really harnessing that full potential of their data, and also harnesses the potential for us to use that data to make really the most informed decision-making that we can do. Another huge challenge that we face on our side is, of course, standardization. It's not the most sexy topic, but it's probably the most important for us when we're looking at evidence, because it comes from so many different sources. And so when we want to fill an evidence gap, standardization can be a really hard factor that needs a lot of work in order to make the data readable, digestible, and actually to pull insights from it. It's a huge process. So in terms of the challenge, I would say harmonizing data formats, data ownership rights, and governance structures is really a crucial underlying challenge that needs to be overcome. And it takes a lot of time. And of course, again, just determining ownership and control so that all this valuable data gets aggregated with clear guidelines. And there are good examples of clear guidelines. But, due to limited access and legal advice, of course, the farmers really don't often agree to share their data without really, as Claire mentioned, realizing the long-term implications or realizing how valuable data really is. And we see that the challenge with that is that it results in farmers losing control over their data, and potentially that data could be used, against their interests without even their knowledge. So, the challenge really highlights the importance of kind of education and awareness campaigns to empower farmers with knowledge about data ownership and control, and the importance of clear and transparent data sharing agreements that really respect farmers' rights and ensure data sovereignty, and also that these rights can be built in smart contracts in blockchain technology that really gives them those governance rights automatically. So that they not everyone necessarily needs to be informed, but that it's built into the platform. So if we can address these challenges, and they're huge ones, the benefit that can be gained from both farmers in terms of productivity, in terms of new revenue streams, in terms of having a voice in systems that they didn't prior, and for us to have really data-driven agriculture is an incredible opportunity. But yes, there are these important challenges that we have to get through first.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah.
You've very well articulated in terms of awareness, farmers training and awareness as a critical aspect. I mean, we can of course talk about the infrastructure, the bandwidth, the connectivity issues. Yes, that is one aspect. But digital literacy, and also in terms of, while yes, there exists guidelines, but farmers' awareness about those guidelines, their rights and interests, and also when they provide consent, for what are they providing consent, and how do they benefit from that? All of that needs to be there. You mentioned an important aspect when you started this particular question was on ownership economy model. I'll come to that in the next round. What are the learnings there? But Srivatsa, I turn to you. If you can talk about what are, and this is more from the challenges in ensuring compliances to the existing data security standards. How do you see that?
Sure. Again, I think Lindsay and Claire put it really well. I'll just try to build upon those things. In my experience, I think the fundamental problem is, or challenge, I would say, is that there isn't enough clarity on the regulation itself. The way there's so much uncertainty in the way the data must be when it comes to data protection and privacy in itself, right? So I think both the data collectors or the data handlers or data givers, none of them are really very, very clear about what does it really mean? What does the regulation mean to them? Therefore, the issue of data ownership and so on and so forth, right? So not everyone is and those that collect the data, not everyone is sure of the moral obligations of handling the data as well. Probably it needs, just like the way we have GDPR, we probably have to have farm data, or FDPR or ADPR, whatever that we want to call, where there's clear guidelines that are laid out to everybody, every actor in the supply chain that is involved in data collection and sharing and consumption, that they have to abide to. And I think that's a very, very important part in my opinion, and that's a challenge as well. So I also think these standards are evolving, right? Especially the standards in emerging economies like us are going to be very different from where we largely work with smallholder farmers. Will be very different from, let's say, a Western world where farmers themselves are a lot more or rather quite big, and then a lot more probably educated about these things, right? So it definitely changes. So but in economies like I said, it is evolving continuously, and that's how it will be for a while till we have a certain standard met. And I believe, while it's a challenge, I believe a consortium-led approach where both private and public consortiums come together to solve and follow a certain rules of the game, right? I think that's very important. Secondly, I think one of the biggest challenges that we always have is the availability of the data itself. We may first we may not even know what data to be captured and what data to be handled. Then availability of the data itself. Data is being, like I said, generated by multiple organizations in siloed approaches. There's no open platform for sharing the data, right? Therefore, when the moment data resides in silos, it's always subject to a compromise, right? So therefore, I think we have to solve for it from a holistic angle, where consortiums come together to create agriculture data exchange platform. I was in one of the forums a few months ago in Delhi around digital agriculture, and one of the themes that came out there was essentially around creating the data exchange, agriculture data exchange platform. That's where I'm drawing some of my insights from. And of the data that's available, the low quality of data, that's another issue that I see, which contributes to incomplete data sets, and eventually you don't know whether that must be preserved, not preserved, or whatever, and stuff like that, right? And a few others, I'm sure, which will revolve around data collection itself, is the uniformity of the data collection, or having, if data has to be collected and shared democratically in a safest manner, then again, we need to have things like standardization of data. Do we have a common farmer ID? Do we have a common farm ID? Do we have a crop ID? I mean, where the basic set of data is established and shared with everyone else for further developing on the use case and stuff like that, right? So I think that's another challenge and also sort of solution that we need to go after. Thirdly, again, when it comes to data acquisition, largely ground truthing is what is being followed today, but then we are moving towards data being connected using satellite remote sensing, or it could be IoT enabled devices and stuff like that. While that's great to ensure that the source data itself is probably more authentic than manual feeding in data, but that also poses a challenge around what is the data security when it comes to storage of data and transmission of data. Let's say if the systems will have to work in areas where there is no network availability, where do you fundamentally store data in the offline mode? So is offline is infrastructure secured enough for data when it is stored in the offline that it's not going to be compromised, right? Or when it is moving from an offline to an online mode, is there enough data security in transmission of data itself? So that's another challenge. I think technically we'll need to solve, and I think it should be a lot easier to solve that problem as well. And we discussed about non-standardization of data and storing, sharing, and the way data is processed, handled, discarded. All of that, I think, needs a lot of work to be done within the smallholder farmers to educate them. And there is a very fine line between data privacy, data security, and data usability. I think that's something which we must definitely solve for. Sometimes in the paranoia of data security and privacy, we may miss out on usable data as well, right? So that's something which we definitely will have to look at. And also accuracy of the data. So for instance, we were recently out there somewhere in one of the working with the farmer producer companies where we were getting the data onto the system where the same four farmers, there are four different farmers, they all have the same land records. For example, when it comes to they may have different physical lands, but then when it comes to paper, they still hold only one land record that is shared between four, but there isn't very clear bifurcation of who owns how much, and then who will be the owner. Are these four farmers that will be the owners, therefore we need to provide security with them, or is it somebody else that's fundamentally holding the land itself? So those challenges continue to exist. I think some of those other speakers have touched upon, but largely this is what I think are fundamental challenges on the ground that we see day in, day out when it comes to handling data. I'll pause there, but that's my feedback. Yeah.
Thanks, Shivats. So now we've reached a situation where there's a talk of data everywhere, and not a data set that is secure and not a single data point that can be used. And as panel members, it's our responsibility to, while yes, of course, highlighting the challenges and problems, also move into the solutions mode. And Lindsay, where I parked my question with you last time, you talked about again ownership economy model. How the ownership economy model, and are there any such more frameworks or models that can potentially provide solutions to improve data sovereignty and security?
Yeah, and I think it's really exciting, with the ownership economy model, and also, the new kind of blockchain technologies create a way that, of course, we have to have the old frameworks, like, of course, GDPR, those types of frameworks and government structures are really important. But this new forms of governance that our technology enables now creates these new options for collaboration that were not possible before, with smart contracts and that kind of work as Lego blocks that you can shape more fluidly in a way that opens up incredibly new opportunities. There's a ownership economy summit at the UN. I think it's ownershipeconomy.com, where you can find a lot of this new research coming out, talking about what are these models that really provide voice automatically associated with data. And I think these new models are really exciting, and I'm glad that being promoted by some of the great thinkers, I think will create really new frameworks for farmers to engage in a way that's meaningful, and that's maybe not even doesn't even need to be facilitated by others, which they can engage in just directly themselves, which I think is really exciting. Because establishing really clear and standardized regulations on data ownership and control and privacy is really essential to what we've all been talking about, in order for us to get the high quality data sets that we want and the secure data sets that we want. Of course, there has to be incentives aligned there, and we haven't found the economic model yet that really facilitates that. But I think we're getting there, especially as farmers are getting more data savvy, and incentives are, that data can maybe in the future be as valuable as the crops themselves, especially when we're looking at weather patterns and other kind of financial flows. So I think leveraging these advanced technologies and the decentralization that they offer can provide these, really enhanced security for farmers and enable kind of control, ownership, and transparency. So as Srivastava was talking about, kind of this distributed ledger that's inherent within blockchain ensures this transparency without necessarily needing to create the same frameworks that haven't been so effective in the past. Other kind of models that I've seen that are really, or frameworks that are useful, AgriDigital, and as an agriculture Australian ag tech company that also uses blockchain to really create these secure and transparent kind of platforms for grain transactions. And that not only ensures that the data is secure, but also just ensuring that farmers receive fair payment and that they are up to date with market prices. And then, of course, like, as we've all been talking about, just robust data security measures, encryption and transmission protocols are something that we always emphasize. So these models, especially those ones trained on decentralized data and sharing, really great, opportunities for benefits that I think are really exciting, and we're going to see come more and more in effect in the upcoming years. So it's an exciting space to be talking about, and I'm looking forward to seeing kind of how it evolves in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Lindsay. Claire, it's my now turn my time to turn to you. In the previous section, we talked about challenges with regards to farmers' awareness on the guidelines, digital literacy as a challenge. And Producer Direct is working substantially on building the capacity of the farmers. Any solutions, models that you may suggest can benefit all our participants, and also not only from a data security perspective, but also in general about data sharing perspective.
Thanks so much. And just maybe to also pick up on some of the points that Lindsay, you are making on incentivization. I think that is really key. How do you incentivize farmers to collect and share accurate data? And I'd argue that there's two aspects to that. So firstly, picking up on the point I was making earlier, how do you support farmers to realize the value of accurate data? And how do you support farmers to have a shared interest in the quality of the data that's being collected, right? As a way of incentivizing accurate data collection and positioning farmers as key actors within the data collection and sharing processes. So maybe to share two examples, I'm not going to say they're solutions. I don't think Producers Direct has cracked it, but examples of what Producers Direct has been working on, and deliberately two examples positioned at two ends of the technology spectrum. So firstly, how do you support farmers who are typically most comfortable with pen and paper to be able to use and contribute accurate data? What we typically see from farmers at that end of the technology spectrum is that one of two things might be true. Farmers might be using paper-based records or logbooks to record their data because somebody has asked them to do it. For example, an extension agent wanting to track the performance on the main crop. Or they might not be recording data at all, literally not have any farm records. And that's particularly true for female smallholder farmers who, if they're producing crops for food rather than cash, largely remain undocumented as in terms of what they're doing on the farm. And so recognizing this, Producers Direct has been working with farmer design groups to test how farmers can be incentivized to track their data using paper logbooks, but in ways that they can then apply it to better analyze how their farm is performing, rather than just doing that because somebody has asked them to do it. And then we've been pairing farmer groups with youth leaders within the communities who are excited about supporting farmers to digitize their paper-based records. And then we've been supporting the youth actually to become data analysts and supporting them to share back data insights with farmers in formats that farmers are comfortable with. And so really looking at the opportunity for youth within smallholder communities to play key roles in digital innovation, as, for example, sort of a data scientist. So reframing what young people can do to support smallholder communities. A key thing here is really looking at the way that data is played back to farmers and understanding what farmers find useful and understandable in what formats. You know, obviously what looks like a clear graph to one person isn't the same for another. And so they're really learning about how farmers can these data insights can be shared back with farmers in ways that are understandable and actionable in order for farmers to realize the value from them, and therefore fuel that feedback loop where farmers are then incentivized to collect more accurate data to support their own farm management practices, as well as to share with other third parties. The second example I wanted to share is a digital app. So on the smartphone end of the technology spectrum that Producers Direct has been developing in partnership with the International Tropical Agriculture Centre, CIAT, and the design agency IDEO, which is being supported by GIZ. And essentially, it's an example, Copy is the app, is an example of how to support farmers to benefit from data insights as a result of sharing their data. So Copy first is looking at the opportunity for AI to support smallholder agriculture in relation to yield predictions. And secondly, when smallholders contribute their data to training the AI model, how they realize data insights back from being able to share their data. And so that's obviously, you know, we've talked a little bit about AI, but it's, you know, one of the big challenges with the AI and how it benefits smallholder farmers with data insights is ensuring that the ground truthing data from smallholder farmers is available in order to train the AI models. And currently that remains largely a significant barrier to smallholders being able to access those data insights. And so with Copy, we're looking to at least challenge that barrier. And so the idea with Copy is that a farmer uses a smartphone. We're starting with coffee to take a photo of their coffee bush. And as a result of sharing that data, they immediately receive an AI-generated yield prediction back based on the photo. And so the quality of the photo data shared immediately affects the yield prediction that's generated. And we are looking at how to pair that yield prediction with actionable agronomic and financial tips that support farmers with on-farm management and financial planning as a result of the yield prediction. So again, driving that loop where the provision of accurate data benefits the farmers as well as third parties. And so almost the data that's then being shared with it or has the potential to be shared with external parties is almost like a secondary benefit. The main feedback loop is between the farmer and the data sharing. But at the same time, COPY is building a low-cost ground truthing data set from smallholder farmers that can be used to continually train and refine the AI model. So essentially looking at firstly at how farmers can benefit from that data set directly as a result of informed decision-making on their farms, but we're also testing the willingness of external parties to pay to access aggregated data and essentially looking at models whereby that if people are willing to pay to access that data, how that financial benefit gets shared back with smallholder farmers so that essentially, again, the value realized from this data set remains firmly in the hands of smallholder farmers themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And before I look at this, the questions that have been, and I'm tempted to take up that questions, but one last time, Srivatsa, I'll come to you. You talked about the blockchain and how can this blockchain enable data security. Just getting one step, moving one step further, if you look at only from a data collection perspective, what is it that the data collectors need to do, any frameworks, any guidelines, any mechanisms, so that at that stage itself we have addressed the challenge of data security?
Absolutely. Like I said before, I think it's a moral and a very responsible activity to hold somebody's data. I think it needs to be addressed in both one with a technology approach, the other one with a non-technology approach. I will talk very briefly about non-technology approach, and then I'll give my 2 cents on the tech approach to it. I think it's very, very important to educate the farmers in the first place. What data are we collecting? What is the purpose of the data? How are we going to process the data? Are we, for instance, when we're working with a farmer group here in Karnataka, we essentially are addressing 3 different use cases, leveraging farmers, smallholder farmers' data. One for the purpose of, let's say, creating market linkages. The other one is for the purpose of creating a traceability of the data. The other one is for creating, let's say, carbon finance. The other one is for creating access to finance for the entire value chain. So I think it's very, very important to communicate to the farmers the benefits and eventual objective and how the data is going to be processed in their favor. So immediately whenever we go on the field, the first thing that we would sort of try and communicate with farmers is about that part, which is the purpose of the data itself, right? And what data is meant for what. So the purpose related with the data that is collected. Why do we collect the data, for example? And who has access to this? So for fundamental questions that they have is who would have access to this type of personal data. Some are personal data, some may not be personal data, but then generally I think it's a responsibility of we data collectors to keep a farmer informed in the language that they understand. Fundamental problem is to ensure that we communicate this to the farmers in the language they understand. Again, very local problem probably to India because of the diverse linguistic abilities that we have across the country. So it's very, very important to bring it to their notice in a way they understand it. And for example, even educating how long would the data be with us, and how are we going to secure their data and so on and so forth. I think that makes a lot easier when to start with the data collection itself, right? And while that's the take on the data collection itself, but when it comes to now storage, which is where storage and probably sharing, which is where I think a tech approach must be followed. We talked about consent, but how do you take consent and categorically, explicitly take consent and keep it in the system? So, for example, when we work with, especially in our carbon financing projects, there is a consent form that every farmer signs up with. Firstly, reading the consent form in the language that they understand, and then signing up for their consent for the data that's collected, right? Which essentially eventually leads to very transparent privacy policies which are provided to the farmer, so that any tech, whether it is mobile app or whatever that app that's involved in collecting the data, that it must really talk about the consent well, and also. What is the extent of data that we collect? Do we overdo? Do we underdo? Like we said, we have to have very, very balanced approach of what data is necessary and what data is not necessary. And to a great extent, technology can play a role where there is derivative of the data that you can do based on some fundamental metadata that's been collected. You can derive data which you don't have to necessarily collect, but then you can derive data based on that. And as we discussed, I think there's always a preparedness that organizations will have to deal with data breaches, to deal with their own internal securities. When we went through GDPR, ISO certifications ourselves, then we realized it's not just about collecting the data in the field by the farmer. It's about how do you put a whole lot of processes back in the organization to ensure that only folks who have access to data with a secure storage, right? How do you ensure that data breaches, we prepared for data breaches? How do you internally as well communicate to our own staff internally as well on awareness about how the data must be handled? I think these are all something that must be looked at, and therefore I'm of the opinion that unless this entire process of collecting and handling both front and back end, it must become a regulatory regulatory for somebody to comply to. That's my feedback. Yeah.
Thanks, Srivats. And you've touched upon the regulatory aspects, the contracts aspect, and this was incidentally one of the questions also that was asked. More of this we'll touch upon in our subsequent session, which is specifically looking at the data governance, and there the panelists will talk more on that aspect. But another 30-40 seconds, an interesting question that has come up, and I would request everyone to answer that question. How do we do a balancing act? An environment that fosters innovation, that ensures data security, that promotes economic development. How do we do a balancing act? 30-40 seconds from each. I can start with Lindsay, please. Lindsay, you're on mute.
I think I'm on mute because I was intimidated by the question, Earl. It's definitely not an easy question. I mean, the balance, I think there's never a balance. And this is something that we deal with in AI a lot, overfitting versus kind of underfitting data, depending on what the purpose is. Sometimes you have to favor the economic benefit. Sometimes you have to favor data security. No, there's no perfect answer to that. I think, it depends on, like I said, it depends on the question. I would say that privacy is and security is always for us the number one factor that we consider above everything else, just because without it, we find that everything else breaks down, trust breaks down, and then you're not getting a free flow of the information. So I would prioritize that above everything. And then the literacy of understanding what's actually happening goes along with that same trust is a central mechanism, teaching people, engaging with them. And so education and awareness, I would say, are the two things I would prioritize in this balancing act. But I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, if I move on to you, please.
I think,
and more specifically, farmers' interests as well as also business interests. How do we balance this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have the answer, as Lindsay was saying. It's really complicated. What I would advocate for is having more people around the table from the onset to understand what that balance needs to be. Because I think typically on any process for data management, the system is typically defined by the interests of one party, and then interests of other parties are kind of considered later on as adoption and kind of barriers to adoption are thought through. So, you know, what I would look at is like how do you enable more stakeholders to come together at the early stage of the process to look at what genuine data sharing looks like, and what understanding the interests of all parties in order to define what that balance needs to be. So that might be ducking the answer, but facilitation and collaboration in co-design.
Vivek, over to you.
Sure, I'll duck it as well. But anyway, I think the balancing act can come in only when multiple stakeholders are coming in with a common purpose of handling the data. I think it's extremely important to have a balanced ecosystem players that come together in handling the data, right? So, and eventually it has to benefit the smallholder farmers. So if it does not, then it does not help anyone, either a business or whatever. So what we have essentially seen is that it becomes a lot more easier to handle data when we have very clearly established the benefits of somebody sharing that, especially at the farm level, benefit of that being shared, very clearly communicated, and eventually incentivizing farmers for that. So I think balance is definitely required. Like I said, I don't think any one single organization can really balance it out. So it is.
But Lindsay, I have another connected question. See, while we do, yes, face challenges in terms of balancing act, but yes, as we prioritized capacity building of farmers as an important initiative, who will bear the cost of this?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I don't think one organization necessarily needs to bear the cost for the capacity building. I think it really can be shared upon amongst multiple stakeholders. So nonprofits, governments, international development agencies, and there are blended finance models that combined public and private sector funding that can really be an effective approach to financing the requirements of these initiatives. You know, like Claire mentioned, testing the willingness to pay, develop metrics we're willing to pay for data at the farm level when it fills a gap. And so I think having private sector actors like ourselves that are willing to finance these kind of initiatives in combination with donors that we work with, nonprofits, governments, and also international development agencies, I think we can form really important coalitions to finance this data and make sure that the economic benefit is ultimately accruing to the farmer.
Thanks, Lindsay. And while there are more questions and the discussion can move on more, it will take more time, but I'm cognizant of the time. And just in the interest of the time, I would now like to summarize our session more in terms of what we all agreed and also accepted is that there is an urgent need to address concerns regarding the way data privacy is managed, as it is leading to reluctance, or it may lead to reluctance among farmers to adopt new technologies, and also would possibly negatively impact the entire ecosystem. The second aspect that we discussed or we touched upon is that one size fits all approach to addressing privacy will not effectively address stakeholder concerns and would also limit the realization of benefits for data sharing for the smallholder farmers. Thirdly, in order to unlock the potential of data sharing, we need to ensure that responsible data management practices are developed and integrated into the life cycle of the product or the services, from development to deployment and adoption. Expanding it further, some of the interventions that we looked at, basically creating an enabling environment would be more of an indirect intervention. We looked at intermediary interventions and more direct interventions, such as building the capacity of the farmers. We also looked at interventions related to ensuring that the data standards are defined in a manner that they can foster data interoperability, and also there's a need to demonstrate the potential and incentivize farmers so that the entire ecosystem becomes more data driven. With these thoughts, I thank you all, Lindsay, Claire, Srivatsa, for your presence in this session, and also all the participants for joining us in this session. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.